It's so bad. I don't want that.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicholas Tamoncho, and I am Associate Professor of Architecture and Design and Director of the Berkeley Center for New Media. This is one of several joint lectures this year between the Department of Architecture and the Berkeley Center for New Media. And since I'm a professor in one and the director of the other, I think I'm standing up here tonight by a very simple process of elimination. But that said, I think it is a particular testament to our speaker here tonight that each of us, my colleagues who organized the History and Theory of New Media series at HTNM and my colleagues here in architecture, actually invited Professor Steenson separately to speak this fall, and of course we're happy enough to be able to coordinate once we've done so. Wright Steenson is currently the Senior Associate Dean for Research in the College of Fine Arts, the K&L Gates Associate Professor in Ethics and Computational Technologies, and an Associate Professor in the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon University. Her PhD is in architecture. Steenson has also, I think very crucially to what we'll hear tonight, been around the web and all of its networked technologies since the very beginning. I'll quote from her own very well-written bio here, since it explains things much better than I can. Quote, I built the first news delivering website at Reuters in 1995, managed the second most hit page on the internet, the Netscape search page in 1996, worked on some of the first web-based online communities, and co-founded a groundbreaking pop culture feminist webzine, Maxi. I was one of the very first content strategists and user customer experience architects, and worked on complex digital platforms and companies like Scient and Razorfish. I continue to study how technology and interactivity fit into our contemporary cities and lives, an interest that has sent me to India to study mobile phones, to China to study social networking sites, and to the 1960s to study the effect of artificial intelligence on architectural systems and interactivity, a subject about which I think we'll be hearing in particular this evening. I wouldn't take much more of your time, but I would like to point out that in both the intellectual context of this twin lecture of contemporary cities and landscapes on the one hand, and the critical understanding of new media on the other, it is hopefully no longer remarkable to understand that technology is, first and foremost, a cultural and social artifact. It is for such a reason, for example, that digital mapping preserves the logic of targeting despite a half-century passing from its military origins. Or parametric models unconsciously preserve the sinuous lines of the Citroëns and Renaults, not to mention fighter planes that their mathematics were developed to produce. As architects in particular, we don't really like to come to grips with the fact that at least after the May line, almost all of our tools were developed by and for others. Leavings at the table. But it is only by understanding and embracing this somewhat indigestible truth that we can open ourselves up to its corollary, that there are particular times and places where the reverse is astonishingly true, where paradigms of design and building escape through digital media into our culture and society at large. It is to both such possibilities and their projections into the future that Professor Steenson dedicates her work and research, and it is particularly why we delight in welcoming her here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Wright Steenson to UC Berkeley.
Hello. It's wonderful to be here and to be welcomed by friends and a community that has had a lot of shaping to do with my own thoughts. So thank you to the School of Architecture, the Center for, the Berkeley Center for New Media, to Nicholas, of course, to Renee, to Yehuda Calais for coming, to Jennifer Wang and Laura Wolf and Eleanor for hosting colloquium, and the colloquium students who came today, even though noontime is a sleepy, sleepy hour, to have a lecture when people are skateboarding outside. And today Bates, who I know isn't here, but I thank you for the invitation. So I mentioned that a couple of years ago, in fact more than a couple, I'd say 2004, I was sitting in this auditorium for a conference that was held here called Distributed Form Network Practice. It was organized by Anthony Burke, who was an assistant professor here at the time. He's now a professor at UTS in Sydney. And Therese Tierney, whose son is a good friend of mine from architecture school myself. And in the middle, what you see here is a screenshot of the fabulous Flash-based interface that shows all the connections between the speakers. If you Google it, you can still play with it. It even works, just not on your cell phone. And this was a very important conference. It was trying to put into place a lot of the network effects around computing and around architecture. And I went back and looked at the book in putting together my presentation for today. And wanted to revisit what it had to say, because I think we're still framing these same ideas. And what they had to say at that time was, in 2004, we set out to form a broadly defined perspective, inclusive of science, art, and architecture, to explore networks not only through their visible forms, but also in terms of operationalizing network theory for its creative potential within design practices. We conceived of a trajectory of research that would establish a baseline for this moment in design, post-disciplinary in its nature, and necessarily as introspective as it is encompassing, that could reformat histories as much as construct new vectors of investigation in a broad range of network forms and the relationship to design in process, practice, and places, what we've called network practices. And they went on to say that they wanted to use this as a way to analyze how art, science, and architecture shape and are shaped by a diverse array of social, cultural, and technical networks, and how they respond to rapidly changing mobile, wireless, and ultimately information-embedded environments. And I'm reminded of the conversation that I was having with Kyle Steinfeld, who I just forgot to thank a moment ago, but having with Kyle Steinfeld today over coffee, and the fact that we're trying to figure out whether this moment that we're in is similar or different from before. And I have my own conclusions, perhaps you do too, but maybe we can use this lecture as an opportunity to dig into that question. Are we at a similar moment for AI and architecture? And if that's the case, when did this moment start? I wonder if maybe it's been going for a long time. So let's use this conversation here of history to frame the present moment. And take a look at our fascinations, anxieties, plenty of anxieties, tensions and transmissions, and possibilities. So I'm going to introduce the work of 4 architects. There is a Berkeley strand through here, there's an MIT strand, a British strand, and a TED Talk strand. I'm going to bring to you Richard Saul-Wurman, we'll have Christopher Alexander, Cedric Price, and Nicholas Negroponte. It's possible that if you know who these figures are, you might not think of them as architects, particularly Richard Saul-Wurman. If you do know some of these architects, you may not like all of them. Christopher Alexander, while an emeritus professor here, who's now living in the UK again, has had a pretty tense history within architecture. So maybe you fall on one side or the other of that polemic. Many people love him, and many people hate him. Cedric Price, we'll see. But also I want to start by framing what we mean by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is not new. John McCarthy coined the term artificial intelligence in 1955, and he described it as making machines do things that would require intelligence if done by man. The notion of AI had existed before, but it's just, he won out in the terminology game. J.C.R. Licklider introduced another concept that's vital and that we continue to talk about today when we talk about human-computer interaction in an intelligent framework. He calls it man-computer symbiosis. And in 1960, he said man-computer symbiosis will involve very close coupling between the human and the electronic members of the partnership. We could look at someone like Marvin Minsky, who in 1961 claimed things that Elon Musk claimed in 2015, if he hasn't changed his mind. I believe that we are on the threshold of an era that will be strongly influenced and quite possibly dominated by intelligent problem-solving machines. So when I'm talking about artificial intelligence, I'm talking about a long history of it, and others might claim that it goes back thousands of years. Or we could start with this moment. In 2016, on the stage of the AIA conference in Philadelphia, Rem Koolhaas sat down with Mohsen Mustafa, I can never say his name right, Mohsen Mustafavi for an interview about the state of the world. And Rem Koolhaas was not so keen on Silicon Valley in this conversation. And he said, architecture in the language of architecture, platform, blueprints, structure, became almost the preferred language for indicating a lot of phenomena that we're facing from Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley took over our metaphors, and it made me think that regardless of our speed, which is too slow for Silicon Valley, we can perhaps think of the modern world maybe not always in the form of buildings, but in the form of knowledge or organization and structure in society that we can offer and provide. You might have forgotten that in 2003, he edited an issue of Wired with members of AMO, and this was Cool World, the Rem Koolhaas presenting the ultimate atlas of basically information spaces of the 21st century. But 40 years before that, on almost the same month, in the same city, Richard Saul Wurman sat down on the stage in 1976 of the AIA convention that he had chaired. Richard Saul Wurman is a protege, was mentored by Lou Kahn, and is still someone that he credits for shaping his thinking. And this is the brochure cover for what he called the architecture of information. And this was a kind of conference that you might imagine going to today. It sounds like a TED conference, and that's probably not a surprise given that that's what he would go on to found about 20 years later. Buckminster Fuller gave a morning keynote, Frank Gehry spoke, William Fetter, who's one of the founding father of computer graphics, spoke. There were different talks like how to spec an interface, detail an input, and supervise a programming process. There was something called Space Doctors, communicating the city and information about the environment, context, and meaning. Jonas Salk even spoke. Richard Saul Wurman went on to popularize this idea of architectures of information. And it was, you could look at something like making the city observable, which you'll have in the library here, or you can find on JSTOR, or HATS, which has nothing to do with HATS, but is rather about the organization of information, and the book Information Architects. And this was a book that had a massive influence on a burgeoning group of computer-oriented, web-oriented designers. Here's what Wurman had to say to these people, or of these people in 1996. And yet, through this field of black volcanic ash has come a group of people, small in number, deep in passion, called the information architects, who have begun to ply their trade and make themselves visible and develop a body of work in paper, in electronic interfaces, and in some extraordinary exhibitions. These people will be the wave of the future. So I start there because I want to frame some of these transmissions that go back and forth, that what we seem to think is new is old and is new again, and are still our long-standing concerns for architects who deal with information and grapple with its consequences. Christopher Alexander was born in 1936 in Vienna. He grew up in England. He was educated at Cambridge. He did his PhD at Harvard, and he joined the Berkeley faculty, if I recall correctly, in 1963. He founded something here in the School of Architecture called the Center for Environmental Structure, and is both a polemical and extremely influential figure. And it's always a little scary to talk about him, particularly in the school where he was a professor for decades, because his status seems to shift over time, as I've noted. As I see it, one of the things that he did was design an operating system for architecture, if not for order itself. He saw design and design processes as adaptive and intelligent. And that he was interested in changing the politics of the design process. And he was also interested in stirring the pot. So you could look at this book that he wrote with Serge Chermayeff called Community and Privacy, and you begin to see why he pissed off designers so badly. Here he says, monuments and doghouse alike bear the dreadful imprint of self-appointed genius or just plain incompetence. And what he wanted to see people do is develop a model. He wanted to see designers and architects develop a model to test their biases in the design process, to not just design what would make the most beautiful thing that they had in their heads, but rather the most fair, equitable, and best solution for a particular situation. And he believed that if you could organize the solution well enough and structure it well enough, it would be adaptive, it would be intelligent, and it would learn over time. Christopher Alexander is best known for two books, although he wrote many, many books. Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which was the published version of his dissertation, came out in 1964, and A Pattern Language, which came out in 1977. But there's a lot between the two. And in Notes on the Synthesis of Form, he brought together a lot of different influences. One of them, in fact, this is right at the beginning of the book, is Plato. This is Plato's statement about rhetoric, about how you break down the particulars of an argument to bring them back together and make them whole. In Notes on the Synthesis of Form, he describes design as good design being the absence of bad fit. And he said that every design problem begins with an effort to achieve fitness between two entities, the form in question and its context. And if you read the book, and if you haven't, it's actually worth, if you haven't read it in a while, it's worth rereading. If you have never read it, read the footnotes. You start seeing things like this. You see On Growth and Form, which talk about the forces of a design problem through a lens of biological morphology, through biology, through how creatures get to be what they are. Or Principles of Gestalt Psychology by Kafka. That's that idea of fitness, of things fitting together, or parts and wholes. That comes from Kafka. And Ross Ashby, Design for a Brain, which is a model of a brain in hardware from 1952. Ross Ashby was a cybernetician and a participant in early work in artificial intelligence. And indeed, this project for me, this book project, this dissertation, this thing that I've been pursuing for 13 years came from Alexander himself. I mentioned that I read footnotes, and this footnote pointed to Ross Ashby, Marvin Minsky, and John McCarthy, all of whom I've mentioned so far in this lecture. This idea of being on the brink of times when man may be able to magnify his intellectual and inventive capability, just as in the 19th century, he used machines to magnify his physical capacity. It sounds pretty familiar. In Notes on the Synthesis of Form, he advocated for thinking of design, the structure of a design problem as a tree. And a tree would be essentially a node with 2 points connected to it, 2 vertices connected. And the way that would break down is you'd think of all of the requirements of a design problem, and you'd break it down further. So you might think function, and then you break function down into production, safety, and use, and then you break it down further. And then you as a designer would try to figure out how best to chunk together and group those requirements so you could design more effectively for them. This is going to be some strange background noise here. There's some nice computer music. He also was one of the first architects to use a computer. Aside from some people at SOM in the 1950s, Christopher Alexander in about 1961 was one of the first people to be first architects to be working with a computer. And so he wanted to use a computer to compare and group these requirements. This is what that computer looked like. This is one from the Mercury project in, I believe, in Texas.
Far to the north and east of Corpus Christi is the heart of the worldwide Mercury network, the computing and communication center that's on this in.
So I just wanted to show you how you program this computer. It's quite a bit different than today. There isn't a traditional terminal. And the size of his data, the number of requirements that his system could calculate, was basically predicated on what was possible for it to calculate. Here are the tree diagrams that he's created, and if anybody here has worked in the field of front-end development or user experience design or information architecture, you'll be very familiar with tree diagrams like this. These were diagrams for the development and design of the HIDEX system, which is a design for highway interchanges. This is upstairs in your library. He also applied this, he and his colleagues in the Center for Environmental Structure applied this method to the design of requirements for BART. I kind of wish we might do this today because BART's really seen better days, of course. But this is in the library. You can pull it off the shelf and take a look at it and see these different requirements. They worked with civil engineers until the civil engineers didn't agree with them anymore and fired them, but they still tried to use this method. But then the computer program got better. He improved it, and it became possible to calculate a more interesting and more complex network, what he called a semilattice. And there's a piece that he wrote called "A City is Not a Tree," which looks at how this semi-lattice might work, how different elements, say, of a corner in Berkeley would function, how you could think of that corner as a bunch of interrelated systems, that maybe the cashier at the drugstore had something to do with the parking meter through the change that someone might put in it. Or there's a question of the newspaper box, or whatever it might be. But this idea became very popular in about 2004 through a number of interaction designers who found this article and found it a good way to think about applying ideas of interactivity and ideas of design at the scale of a city. In "A City is Not a Tree," Alexander grappled to find real-life examples where this actually worked, and kind of came up with the idea that maybe an open society model would begin to get there, but it really kind of wasn't sorting it out. And so the Center for Environmental Structure spent the next many years working on the idea of patterns. And a pattern is a network. A pattern language is a network. 253 patterns from large scale to small scale, and a philosophy of patterns. And this is where they get to by the late 1970s. And it's especially apparent, there are a number of books that the center publishes, but it's especially apparent for these two books, A Pattern Language, published by Christopher Alexander, Sarah Ishikawa, Murray Silverstein, and other members of the CES, and The Timeless Way of Building, which was Alexander's philosophy of design. They describe patterns as the following. Each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in the environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use this solution a million times over without ever doing the same thing twice, doing it the same way twice. The way that a pattern works is like this. There is a format to them and a grammar to them. There's a headline and a number. It exists in a hierarchy. The star meant they were very sure about this pattern. There's a photograph. There are problem statements and sketches to explain what the pattern was and what circumstances it would operate in. And then at the tail end, it lists a number of other patterns that it connects to. So if you were to start designing a project, let's say you're designing a row house, you would take this pattern, the patterns around it in the hierarchy, the patterns that it links to, the ones mentioned at the end, and the idea would be that over time you would be able to come up with an idea in your head of what that project is that you want to build, and you'd have some ways to do it. This shows some of the hierarchy. It starts very, very big, like the size of cities, and it gets very, very small, down to the placement of things in a room. And I find myself thinking in this movement from trees to semi-lattices to patterns of Paul Baran's famous networks of communication from 1964, which talks about this hub and spoke kind of network, a decentralized network, and then the security of a distributed network, which, if it were under attack, would be able to survive better than a simpler network. And similarly, this network of patterns that we see here that Alexander shows us in Timeless Way of Building seems to be the same kind of connected, multi-directional pattern. I do appreciate something. I got to revisit this today. This is also in your library upstairs. There's something that is called the Pattern Manual, and it's just some bylaws for the Center for Environmental Structure. But in 1967, this is 12 years before a pattern language, a decade before pattern language was published, they started noting that as soon as possible we shall offer a service which does make full use of the pattern language. In this case, the entire stock of patterns and the language which ties them together will be stored in a computer. If a user wants to use the language in a design project, she will be able to state the nature of her project, answer certain questions about its context, and then receive a specially created subsystem of patterns. The user who maintains access to the computer will always have the entire pattern language at her fingertips in its latest stage of evolution. So maybe it isn't a surprise that around 1987, a couple of engineers would start applying patterns and Christopher Alexander's ideas to the development of an object-oriented programming language called Smalltalk. This is Ward Cunningham and Kent Beck. As you can see, they make nerdy things happen. And they realized, both of them had become acquainted with Alexander's work when they were university students. Kent Beck couldn't afford the books, they're expensive, so he'd go to the bookstore and he'd leaf through a few pages at a time, and then come back another time, leaf through, and bit by bit made his way through the book. And they realized that using a pattern language would be a good way to think through and then capture the implications of patterns on the implications of the programming decisions they were making. And the idea was a hit. So in 1987, they shared it at a conference. Groups began meeting at conferences and in nice places outside the Bay Area. And in 1994, a group of people called the Gang of Four, these four men, published a book called Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software in 1994. And what you see here is, again, a network of patterns. Christopher Alexander defined how engineers, computer scientists, developers, and UX designers, among many others, defined how they talk about architecture. Also sometimes impressed, he's the only architect they know. If you've ever heard of the Agile programming method, or Scrums, then you would also see another point of influence from Alexander. Kent Beck took some of the notions, Beck and Cunningham both took the notions from timeless wave building and applied them to the programming process. And in 2001, the Agile Software Development Manifesto was published. Gord Cunningham was the inventor also of the wiki. So you've used Wikipedia, surely. The format that runs Wikipedia is something that grows from the center out. And Gord Cunningham was directly, again, inspired by Christopher Alexander. He never patented or trademarked it. And this is why it's in such heavy use today. There are something like 1,200 books about patterns and pattern languages out there in any number of fields today, showing its further influence. But I'm always struck by what Christopher Alexander said in 1996 when he was asked to keynote the object-oriented programming convention in San Jose. So a few months after I was working at Netscape, he was down in San Jose telling them this, and he seemed to understand the stakes of what he was doing and the influence of what he had done and where they stood today. He said, "You almost can't name a facet of the world which is not already, to some very strong degree, under the influence of the programs that are being written to manage and control those entities or those operations." So let's change gears. This is Cedric Price. Cedric Price is a British architect. If you're in a school of architecture, you've been here for a while, you probably are familiar with his work. If you're from outside of architecture, it's quite possible you've never heard of him. He was born in 1934. He died in 2003. He was a professor at the Architectural Association in London and maintained his own practice throughout his entire life. His life partner was Eleanor Braun, who was in the Beatles movies and was the inspiration for the song Eleanor Rigby, among other things. And he's famous for being provocative. This is one of his most famous quotes. "Technology is the answer, but what was the question?" And I should mention that most of his work was not built. So it wasn't, some of it was intended to be a provocation, but most of it was designed as though it would have been built. So this is a drawing of the Fun Palace, which he worked on with the radical theater director Joan Littlewood. From 1963 to 1970, they tried to get it built. And it was a cybernetic theater learning space. The components of it were movable. It was intended to learn from its visitors over time. It intended to change them over time. In fact, if you can see this cybernetic chart on the right, you see that it says right here, input of unmodified people, output of modified people. He worked with a 27-member cybernetic committee with some of the most important cyberneticists in Great Britain on this project in order to try and bring it to life. I should mention that he's a lot of fun to work on. I've spent a lot of time in his archives. You find things like this. This is one of the buildings that was built, the Interaction Center, with members of the Jungle Book. You find letters like this. It says, thank you for your letter enclosing the illustrated brochure. This is for a light hovercraft company. We would very much like to see a demonstration. We'll get in touch with you in the near future to arrange this. So he was interested in novel forms of transportation. So hovercraft, helicopter, of course, why not? He also, as noted, he worked with cyberneticians, and one of the ones who had the biggest impact on him and on architecture in some very interesting ways in the 1960s is Gordon Pass. And Gordon Pass wrote in an article in 1969 something that was a little bit different about how to think of the design process. Let us turn the design paradigm in upon itself. Let us apply it to the interaction between the designer and the system she designs, rather than the interaction between the system and the people who inhabit it. It's a different kind of approach to what you would expect from a design process. Pascal designed things, and this is, I apologize for the pixelated nature here, but he designed things like the colloquy of moles, which was just recently redesigned and relaunched and mounted in Detroit by his protege, Paul Pangaro, a former member of the Architecture Machine Group at MIT. These were shapes that you had to dance with and play with, and sometimes play music with in order to attract them to you. And if you did too much of the same thing, they'd get bored and stop interacting with you. So you'd have to figure out a way to approach this boredom program. So this idea comes out in a piece in a project by Cedric Price called Generator, which in 1976, he tried to get it built between 76 and 79. It was an arts retreat center in northern Florida, and it was a set of 12-foot by 12-foot cubes, excuse me, walkways, runways, and barriers. And they could be moved around and recombined however someone wanted to use them. You continually notice this idea. Cedric Price was not going to define the architectural use. That was for the people to decide. And there would be something to push back on those people, to spur them to use the projects in new and different ways. There were a set of previous menus, as he called them. He liked food metaphors a lot, so this is a menu imagining some of the possibilities for drama in Generator. So you see things like very good, walk around to all the angles, and excellent, full of event and taut action. Cedric's sketches are always really nice. Here's the mobile crane on the back of the index card. Here's how it would come together. There'd be a tartan grid that was laying on the ground. The mobile crane would rock the cubes into place. They'd be bonded together, roofs, sides, connections over the top, and then finally people could come and open up the front of their cubes and use them until they wanted to move them again. There were tools like this, little cubits to move them around. He envisioned bleeper walks, and I'm not sure what's up with the mouse in the cube, but it's another interesting provocation. But he realized at a certain point people would be unlikely to request enough moves of Generator. And so he got in touch with John and Julia Fraser and worked with them. They were programmers and architects, and worked with them on a set of programs to change things up a little bit. And John and Julia suggested putting microcontrollers on every piece of Generator, running an architect program to keep the rules of the thing, of Generator, a inventory program to know what all the pieces were and where, a design program, which is what you see here. These plexiglass blocks could be moved around, and then it would be plotted on the computer and on the printer. And the fourth program was the boredom program. And what they said of that is, in the event of the site not being reorganized or changed for some time, the computer starts generating unsolicited plans and improvements. And John Fraser wrote to Cedric Price, if you kick a system, the very least you would expect it to do is kick you back. And then he writes in a postscript on this letter in pen, that seemed to imply that we were only useful if we produced results that you did not expect. I think this leads to some definition of computer aids in general. At least one thing that you would expect from any half-decent program is that it should produce at least one plan, which you did not expect. And this idea also has contemporary valence as well. We seem to keep kind of reinventing this idea. Madeline Gannon, who just received her PhD from the School of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon, is a robot whisperer. And without knowing about Cedric Price or Generator or John Fraser, she designed this robot and has this to say about it.
Comes together and you're in the space with the robot and you just have a very raw experience with this animal-like machine responding to your every move. All the technical aspects sort of melt away into the background. It's incredibly important to have opportunities and spaces to come in and experiment and misuse these existing technologies.
So here's this robot she tamed and got to work with here at Pier 9 Autodesk and trained to interact with people in ways to change their expectations of what it could be and what robots and people could be. So with Cedric Price, we see ideas of cybernetic architecture, early ideas of intelligent buildings, and technologies of provocation for thinking differently. And you also see a good bunch of humor. Cedric Price's archive Cedric Price's archive is at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, as is his library. He had a habit of writing notes in his books, and so you can check books out from the library, and one day I got Cedric Price's copy of The Next Architect that I'm going to talk to you about his book being digital. And here's what Cedric Price had to say about being digital, a 1995 book by Nicholas Negroponte. Good, but dated. This is Nicholas Negroponte. And Nicholas Negroponte is quite possibly best known for founding the MIT Media Lab and for a project called One Laptop Per Child that aimed to solve literacy problems by giving every single child in a developing country a laptop. But before that, he was the founder of co-founder, of MIT's Architecture Machine Group, which was in the School of Architecture and used architecture and computation and a lot of bricolage, a lot of tinkering as an opportunity to pull things together and kind of think differently about computing. He wrote a couple of books, not just being digital. His very first book was called The Architecture Machine, and he dedicated it to the first machine that can appreciate the gesture. You may notice that in my pictures of him, he's always got a finger, he's always gesturing. I want to point out that what made research in the Architecture Machine Group possible at that time was aligning with the other interests in funding at MIT at that time. And to a large extent, the funding paradigm that Nicholas Negroponte and Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert and many other heads of the AI lab and engineering labs at MIT, those were defense-funded entities. So in particular, DARPA, the Information Processing Technology Office, and the Office of Naval Research were absolutely vital in setting the agenda for research in artificial intelligence. And the Architecture Machine Group was an important part of that process. Indeed, Marvin Minsky was a lifelong friend and mentor to Nicholas Negroponte, and the Architecture Machine Group designed many interfaces for artificial intelligence applications for microworlds, these kind of bounded small worlds of research that the AI lab and the AI community engaged in the early 70s. So a couple of projects that they did. You noticed previously this robot that was stacking cubes, and you see this, you can see if you look in sort of the top of the image, you'll see a video camera pointed down. That's the Seymour Papert eye, or the Minsky Papert eye, which found edges of blocks and made it possible to stack them or figure out where they were in space. So the Architecture Machine Group applied this technology to a project called Seek that was a part of the software show at the Jewish Museum. This was a very famous exhibition, involved about 50 different projects in 1970. And Seek was a project in which 450 mirrored blocks would be stacked by a robotic arm. And a horde of gerbils, as you can see if you look right here, would do what gerbils do, just nose them around and make a mess. If you lower right-hand corner, it says, gerbils match widths with computer-built environment. And this is a project about having two different models of the world, and this was something that Nicholas Negroponte wrote about at the time. It was a provocative project, as you see, plenty of great imagery from the software show catalog. This is from the Centerfold Life in a Computerized Environment. And in the essay that accompanies the exhibition, written by curator Jack Burnham, there's a quote from Ted Nelson: "Our bodies are hardware, our behavior software." And this was very true. The software show was a disaster in just about every sense. It nearly bankrupted the Jewish Museum, and it was a disaster also for the gerbils because Seek tended to kill them. There are other things that were kind of questionable at that time too that I think are worth noticing today. There was a project called Interact, which was part of the MIT Urban Systems Laboratory. And Felicity Scott's book, most recent book, has a really great dissection of these various projects. But the book, The Architecture Machine, says of this particular project, Interact, this was a project where members of a housing project sat down and had a conversation with the computer, what they believed was a conversational user interface, about urban issues. And Negroponte says, the three residents had no qualms about talking with the machine in English about personal desires. They did not type uncalled for remarks. Second, the three user inhabitants said things to this machine they would probably not have said to another human, particularly a white planner or politician. To them, the machine was not black, was not white, and surely had no prejudices. And then a few lines later, in parentheses, there's a little note. It says, the reader should know, as the three users did not, that this experiment was conducted over telephone lines with teletypes, with a human at the other end, not a machine. The same experiment will be rerun shortly, this time with a machine at the other end of a telephone line. Maybe I'll just let that one stand. In the later years of the Architecture Machine Group after 1976, after an attempt to get a big NSF grant failed, the Architecture Machine Group had to shift with the funding requirements of artificial intelligence at that time. And what that meant is that there was no longer a possibility of doing basic research that was funded by the Department of Defense. It had to have applied tactical military purpose. And so the reason for the next projects that I'll show you, the proposals for all of them have battlefield uses, explicit battlefield uses. So Aspen Movie Map is a project that kind of looks like what it is. A video disc player would have images of Aspen, Colorado, and you could sit in this Eames lounge chair that had joysticks and zoom yourself down the streets of Aspen, Colorado. On your left and right were two touch screens, and you could move yourself around on a map to get to different parts of the city. Feels a little bit like Google Street View. And this is, again, I don't have a higher quality image of this, but I really do like the picture of how they got the images in Aspen, and you can imagine the great fun they must have been having going there and shooting these movies on their Jeep. The reason for the project was possibilities in remote sensing after a hijacking of an Israeli plane to Entebbe, Uganda, and there had been a simulated rescue in the Negev desert during the night, and so if they were able to do this in some way remotely, they could probably save a lot of lives of soldiers, and that was how the project was justified. And these are the kinds of things that they were writing about in 1978. They said in a project proposal for data space, we're proposing to develop human-computer interfaces, on the one hand, as sophisticated in conception as a cockpit, on the other hand, as operationally simple as a TV. From either perspective, the objective is the same. Usability. The language in some of these proposals is really great. Here you see that armchair, that Eames lounge chair. They give a lot of thought to that. And this is actually a really wonderful thing. There was a newsletter called Architecture Machinations, and the MIT archive has them, so you can go back in time and read them. So they give a lot of thought to the Eames chair. all of these projects took place in a carpeted computer room where the computers were not in the room itself. Computers in the 70s and 60s were really loud. And this was a quiet room where you'd sit in this nice lounge chair and be surrounded, and you'd have this big screen in front of you. And they began to work on projects that would allow for gestural and voice commands. And so the next project is a little bit of a snippet here for a ship fleet command tool called Put That There.
Make a yellow sailboat. Where? North of that. Create a green freighter. Where? East of the sailboat. Create a magenta trawler. Where? There. Put that. Where? There.
And on it goes. But what was unique about this and very difficult to achieve is that any kind of manner of abstraction, put that there, is difficult to achieve. Computer voices have recently gotten a little better. There wasn't quite Siri then. They had projects that proposed augmented reality, and indeed some of the early examples of virtual reality, not the first, but early examples, took place in that media room in the Architecture Machine Group's lab space. Mapping by yourself was a mapping window that could give you more information about the environment behind you, could provide digital layered maps, and they even envisioned that there could be haptic feedback or force feedback as you use the map and moved it around. One of the things I really like in this image over here is the IBM's electric typewriter right behind him as he's using this. I think Nicholas Negroponte understood the stakes of what he was doing. As he said in his second book, Soft Architecture Machines, I strongly believe that it is very important to play with these ideas scientifically and explore applications of machine intelligence that totter between being unimaginably oppressive and unbelievably exciting. And these are words that I keep coming back to today as I try to think through what it is we're doing and what we're talking about. So among the many things that I think Architecture Machine Group brought us before they folded into the Media Lab and became a part of the MIT Media Lab, we see things like interfaces to artificial intelligence. We see how projects have to bend to the necessities of defense funding. But we see something else in Negroponte's work, which is a notion of what intelligence is, and he equates intelligence to ethics. So going back to his early work, to 1970, on the very first page of the Architecture Machine, he talks about that idea of ethics and asks, why ask a machine to learn, to understand, to associate courses with goals, to be self-improving, to be ethical, in short, to be intelligent? He took this idea of ethical in what he called an architecture machine from the work of someone named Warren McCulloch. Warren McCulloch was a cybernetician and a neurophysiologist. And he wrote a paper called Towards Some Circuitry of Ethical Robots in 1952. And basically what he suggests is using Turing machines, sort of thought experiment of intelligent computing, and thinking through what that would be like if they got social. And he said, to be ethical, these must include other organisms and machines which must share effort and reward, or no social questions of good and evil will arise. I shall investigate what machines, by cooperation and competition, can constitute a society where their conduct becomes self-disciplined in a way that serves the ends created by their association. So when Nicholas Negroponte takes these ideas and brings them forward to his own notion of architecture machines, which is to say, artificial intelligence that we live inside, we come up with a world that does these things. We get human-computer symbiosis from our friend JCR Licklider at the beginning of this talk, systems that learn, models of the user, high quality, really great interfaces, and things that operate at the environmental scale of the world around us, that is, at the scale of architecture. And as he says in 1975 about the distant future of architecture machines, they won't help us design. Instead, we will live in them. So I'd like to use, as I conclude here, all of these different examples that we've talked about as a way to frame today's concerns. And one thing that I see a lot is that we're fumbling around ethics. We're using that word a lot. I also have a job title that has the word ethics in it, and I'm not a trained ethicist. But I think we're all trying to say something when we say ethics, and I'm curious about what that really means. So we talked about this a little bit today in colloquium, but you might know about the trolley problem. This is the thought experiment that Philippa Foot, as her name was, popularized around 1967. And you are the trolley operator, or the trolley switch operator. There's a trolley coming, and there are 5 people ahead of you on a track. And they're tied to the track. So if you don't throw the switch, those 5 people are going to die. But if you do throw the switch, 1 person is going to die. And if that person dies, that's going to be because you threw that switch. So either you do something and you kill a person, or you do nothing and you kill 5 people. What's the right thing to do? There is no right answer. And this is the way that we tend to think about ethics. Now, there are trolley problem memes. There's an entire Facebook page of trolley problem memes. They're really funny. There's apparently, I haven't seen it yet, but there's apparently a really great YouTube video of a 2-year-old explaining the trolley problem, and it basically goes, bam, bam, and that's it. It's a trolley problem guy, I don't know. And then there's this one. But when we are talking about the problems of autonomous vehicles, we look at the when we look at the Uber that hit the pedestrian several months back in Tempe, Arizona. And when we say our ethics and our ethical questions around artificial intelligence, one way or another, are framed in trolley problems, I think we're in trouble. We might be considering other things like fairness or accountability. We might be considering the problems of law enforcement. We might be considering matters of life or death. And I'm not sure whether it's something that you've had a chance to see, but a couple months ago in June, the CEO of Google published on Google blog these different principles for Google that they would follow for AI. Be socially beneficial, avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias, be built and tested for safety, be accountable to people, incorporate privacy design principles, uphold high standards of scientific excellence, and be made available for uses that accord with these principles. At a minimum, come on. But then we also look at issues like the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense, funding questions about what is called explainable AI. And in Europe, it is actually required by law now that you can, if an algorithm does something that affects you negatively, you can request an explanation of what happened. Essentially, the idea is that AI needs to explain itself. And that's very hard when we're talking about black boxes. And I don't know about you, but like the Department of Defense is not exactly known for their PowerPoint prowess, and so I'm not sure how far they're going to get on these questions of explainability. Though there are some data visualization experts meeting this month to figure it out. And we might say that transparency is what we need, but transparency isn't enough either, because as we know, too much transparency can actually make things worse. It can be harmful. It can occlude, it can make false binaries, and it can be limited in what it can accomplish in technology and in code. And in fact, Mike Ananny and Kate Crawford might instead suggest that what we need is interpretability. You need to be able to make sense of it. It's not a matter of being hit with a lot of information, but rather whatever happens needs to be modeled and appropriate to you in a world that you understand. And I would argue that these are questions of design and of architecture. So we could end up in a world where we all get a machine learning. And this is near my house. Carnegie Robotics is 4 blocks from where I live. The National Robotics Engineering Center is right where I live in Pittsburgh. I'm not sure what to think about this. So this puts me back where I began, and back into the loving arms of Cedric Price. And I'd leave it with him. Technology is the answer, but what was the question? Thank you.
Thank you, Molly, so much. That was amazing. We have time for some questions from the audience. We'll be passing around a very bouncy, friendly piece of technology here, which is our new Catchbox microphone. There's a question here in the back.
What do I do, talk right into the black piece, keep it about an inch from your
I was here when Christopher Alexander taught in the pattern language, and he had a model next door that was all automated with that C plane project. But anyways, you mentioned 62, 63 first got into the machine age or computers. Down at UCSD, they unraveled the DNA and RNA code, and it led into the visual arts science department, third college. The great debate, they finally founded it, and quite a few of the people for Apple company came out of the visual arts department. Jeff Raskin is one that comes to mind. So I think a lot of what has happened here since the early 60s, architecture is arts and sciences. He did the right thing. Christopher Alexander tuned in and expanded. We have genomes today. We have engineering of genetics. We can actually clone people. So the pattern language really opens it up to where architecture was in. And also we had Louis Kahn with Salk Institute down there.
Yep.
And there were others, Uri at Uri Hall. And now it's the Berkeley Science School in the South. Thank you.
Now you've just sent me off on another decade of work. Thank you for that.
I have a question. Also, while others might collect theirs, you answered a little bit with the last slide, but my most pressing question to you is, why is Cedric Price in this presentation? Which is to say that there's lots about the intellectual and social and technical relationships between the other characters you show and how we live in the world today. That's not so much the case for Cedric, and yet clearly he plays an important role. Maybe you could expand on that point in the last slide.
I'd actually put it differently.
Okay.
The more that I think about this, the more I can't imagine doing this without him. And actually, he and Christopher Alexander had met. Nicholas doesn't believe that he and Cedric had ever had a chance to meet, though he knew of his work. Alexander, Cedric was also friends with Buckminster Fuller. But in particular, it wasn't a direct computer science kind of use, but the role that technology played, and Roy Steenson, New Directions in British Architecture, writes that the point of technology was to provoke into shock. And it was, in all of its different forms for Cedric Price, it was a material for design, but not in very different kinds of ways. So like, for instance, Oxford Corner House is a building that acts like a gigantic computer. You look at something like, you could look at Pottery's ThinkBelt, which was a distributed university on rails that would be linked by closed circuit TV or by radio. All of these are different uses of technology in ways that kind of open up what we could consider an architectural project to be, and finding ways to make architectural material out of these technologies. And in that sense, I think what he's doing is quite similar, but maybe to different ends.
Oh, right, yeah, no, I always feel like he's actually the hero of the story.
He's kind of my hero.
Yeah.
In 1963, it was called Applied Physics and Information Systems. And then it evolved into all the other systems.
We
Because
have
they
another
normally don't
question
apply
elsewhere in
physics.
the audience. Canary and then Eric.
Another thought about the last question would be how this fits into current existential questions about architecture as a discipline. In particular, it seems like a few years ago there were more people found within architecture who were interested in attempting to redefine the discipline in terms of technology and connecting the built environment to ideas about larger network systems. And now it seems as though there's been a change where that isn't in fashion in the same way. And even now that there's more discussions of technology among the general public, it seems as though architecture isn't interested in participating in that in the same way. So it seems like the discipline itself is facing some unanswered questions right now.
I think it depends on where you are and when you are. So I was at Yale from 05 to 07, and I was at Princeton from 07 to 2013. And that's the kind of trailing off dying years of formalism and the long tail of deconstruction. Thank God. Sorry, biases. But there was a real restriction in what was allowed in and what was allowed out. And one of the things I've noticed in some of the schools I attended is that actually there's a broader sense of technological work that's allowed in that isn't only representational or milling oriented or tool oriented, right? You know, there's a wall of where the computers used to be at Yale, there's now a wall of 3D printers that might as well be microwaves because there are so many of them. But I began to see people take on different kinds of questions, and I could also point to the work of someone like Mitch McEwen at Princeton, and the ways that her work in technology and race and gender all intersect to kind of crack open any way that we might have thought about that. Or could look at the work of someone like Jimenez Lai and some of what I've seen coming out of Chicago. So I think those stakes are different in some places. I guess my personal stakes is that in architecture school I got told a lot that I was not architectural. I don't have a studio degree in architecture, but I figure after 8 years in architecture school it counts for something, and you know, you get a PhD, it should be fine. And I used the word anxieties early in this talk, and there seems to be a history of anxiety in architecture about the role of computation. There was a conference in 1964 called Architecture and the Computer that Norman Minsky spoke at, that Walter Gropius gave an opening statement that was read on his behalf. Christopher Alexander was there. And this was a conference where all of the architects were worried that their jobs were going to go because of technology, because of computers. And sometimes I feel like when we're in a school of architecture and there's this anxiety and tension around technology, that it's that same problem, that it's important to say, this is what architecture is and everything outside is not architectural, where it would seem that those boundaries might be more permeable and that there's a lot to explore in the tensions that are there. I mean, maybe the history of technology in architecture or computation in architecture is a long-standing history of anxiety about annihilation of the field.
Eric, here in front.
Hey, Eric.
Great, wonderful. I really appreciate you presenting this work. One, just once as a response, first that comment about, I think it was from Negroponte, about putting together these technologies where sometimes they can be really oppressive or they can be almost exciting and celebratory. At least on a personal note, work that I've done with students, I always tell we're in a sweet spot when we're working on something that I can see as being very oppressive or very exciting. And I know that's actually like an interesting intersection point in the design field. But I want to come back to something that I think you've really hit on, and you've woven this really beautiful narrative across disciplines and across time. And I find that a lot of times, myself and colleagues and students have a hard time seeing that whole perspective and drawing from different disciplines. And you've done it in a way that really pulls a narrative together and shows that we're not in these kind of isolated lanes of operation, and we have to benefit by looking across these disciplines and back in time. I wonder if there's techniques that you think we should operationalize as, working in the academy or working with people in industry to try to change the narrative around how we even approach problems. I mean, you put forth so many great examples historically that have happened, and I wonder if there's maybe a pattern thing that we should look.
This is a good school for having those at hand. We were just talking about Nicholas's studios. The different studios this semester around science fiction and possible futures. I'm really lucky to have as a colleague, and from a decade before that, a friend, Stuart Candy, who's a futurist on our faculty. And what I like about that is you don't know what the future is, but you have ways to explore possibilities of futures. And all sorts of things can impact those futures, things that are far outside where you stand now. For me, when I went back to school after working for a decade, 12 years, and started my master's in doctoral research, I had wanted to study, after going through distributed form network projects, I wanted to study ubiquitous computing and the Internet of Things and technology and digital materiality, all of these things. And it turns out if you do a PhD in architecture, mostly you're going to become a historian. And so that was the tremendous gift that happened as a result, is that I became unstuck in time, to quote Kurt Vonnegut. And I'd also argue that using the other tools that we've got, literature, music, stage, film, all of the ways that we can explore and bring things to bear, all of the ways we can prototype, these are some of the things that should be a part of our toolkit. And I'd say anything is in this.
I think that's a great note to end on. Let's please give Molly a big round of